Hello. This is the first episode of my new podcast, so bear with me. It's been a while since I've podcasted, um, and I'm doing it through Hangouts on Air on Google. To make it a little bit easier, audio tends to come out a little bit better, I've noticed. So, I'll download finished episode, pull the audio out, those sorts of things. But for now, I'm going to just introduce myself. And, the old saying of, in order to know where you're going, you need to know where you've been, comes to mind. So you're right in the middle of a movie and some action scene just happened, but you got to go back to the beginning to understand how you got to this point. So, how did I get to this point? I mean, many years have passed, since I was born. My name is Thomas Holbrook. I was born on March 9th, 1983, on Williams Air Force Base in Arizona. This is 10 years before the B-2 bomber was publicly unveiled. 10 years before that base was closed. So that's going to wind up being the story of my life so far. I get my foot in the door for something, anything really, right before they start shutting the door. So that's been a theme throughout my life. But I grew up, in a household that was, nuclear type family, except, one marriage ends, another one begins, those sorts of things. And at the age of 6, I nearly wind up dying twice. And thanks to Children's Mercy Hospital, I am alive today. So, there's been some close calls in my life, but here I am, alive and breathing. So why start a show like this? Because after all, this isn't the only podcast I've done. I've been involved in another podcast, and that one's kind of stalled, but I'll get into that way later. It's circumstances beyond everybody's control. But I felt that it was time to start, another one that was related to other stuff I was doing. Politics, libertarianism, what libertarianism entails, and what I view from that perspective. It can involve anything from pop culture to problems in the world today, current events. So that's what this particular show will be about. And I started working on this thing last night, and I'm now got an official podcast page up, and the first episode will obviously be available very soon, which I'm doing right now. So in a nutshell, I've given you a little bit of who I am, where I was from. I was born in Arizona. I wasn't there for very long before migration to Missouri occurred. And I've been in Missouri the vast majority of my life. So I would graduate from Leeton High School in 2002. I would go on to some vocational school, finish that. And then I would attend what would later be called the University of Central Missouri. I have a Bachelor of Science in History with a minor in Religious Studies, which, no, I'm not a preacher or anything like that. It's religious studies from a secular academic point of view. And more on that in later episodes. But I also was a former two-time former candidate for U.S. House of Representatives for Missouri's 4th District. The first time I ran in the midterms in 2010, I lost a contested primary by 4 votes. It was pretty close. I won the second time around and managed to wind up on the November 2012 ballot, where I got over 10,000 votes. So, third party, that's pretty good. And lately, we've been kind of skyrocketing. And because of what's been happening this year, people expected this to be another Clinton-Bush matchup. It didn't happen. Well, or it appears to not be happening. The unexpected happened. Jeb Bush dropped out of the race. Clinton's still in the race. Bernie Sanders did not stand a chance, still doesn't, but we'll see what happens. Let's just say this year's been interesting, to say the least. And recently, the Libertarian nominees, Gary Johnson, William Weld, have both been through a media blitz as of late, being on CNN for a town hall event. And really, it was just enough to start a conversation. But more time is needed to help people understand a different perspective on things. And the idea is that, no, you don't always have to toe a particular line. Agree on some core principles, absolutely. But we respect the fact that each individual is different, and that's okay. It's okay to be different. That's the whole point. So, with that in mind, what I want to talk about is how I became a libertarian. It took me a long time to go to college. I had no ambition in life. I, of course, evolved over the years. And it's really the silliest things that, sets you on the path to, significant transformation. I decided to enroll in college after having an argument with my own sibling over something stupid. And I basically gave up, decided to go to college because I didn't have enough confidence in myself to do much of anything. As I met more people and as I was introduced to new ideas, and thanks to access to semi-fast internet, this is before, cable, DSL, other fast forms of internet access became a little bit more widespread in the US. The fastest internet you could find generally was on a college campus. A lot of your fast, high-speed providers were relatively expensive, even in the early 2000s, though that situation has been improving as of late. So even before then, I started getting introduced to, certain ideas, shaking up the establishment, making people uncomfortable with certain preconceived points of view. That's when I was introduced, to Michael Moore. To his credit, he at least started the gears turning a little bit. But I've also learned something else, for that matter. His techniques in his films, it would stir conversation, discussion, especially over the fact that some of the methods being used were frankly deceptive. And he even once stated that his films were more like an op-ed piece in a newspaper. So, people make films and they call them documentaries, and a lot of them are more propaganda. Let's be honest. I still met other people with other points of view. I even saw different points of view. And from there, I would, in 2004, after realizing that things like the USA Patriot Act were not such a good idea, because such things could be used to go after people for relatively minor things. We were under the notion of we need to be safe instead of free. And something about that struck me as wrong. And later on, when the conflict in Iraq occurred, later on, something struck me as wrong about that as well. We're willing to sacrifice our rights to quote unquote be safe, yet at the same time go after somebody who was an arch nemesis of Al-Qaeda. A lot of the stuff didn't make sense to me. And unfortunately, in 2004, I was under the mentality of anybody but Bush. John Kerry seemed to stand the best chance, and it looked like it was going to be a very, very tight, close race. And you see stories about, the Democratic Party trying to raise money to prepare for lawsuits over contested elections and what have you. And then all of a sudden, Kerry bows out. And that raised a red flag. And then I remembered, every now and then you run across people who market themselves well on the internet and they come off as crazy, but every now and then they come up with interesting points such as the fact that Bush and Kerry were actually cousins. They're related. And then I read somebody else's comment that even if Kerry wound up winning, do you really think we would have left Iraq? Of course we wouldn't have. We'd still be there. And that's when I began to understand that the two-party system was a big problem. From there, I would eventually run into a campus organization that had newly been created, Third Party Alliance, which would later evolve into campus college libertarians, because most of the third parties in Missouri were evaporating. This year alone, Constitution Party barely exists. They have a candidate for president, but they're not going to be on the ballot in most states. The Green Party is still recovering from 2008, when they put all their hope in the Democratic nominee, Barack Obama. They didn't run a candidate of their own. They lost ballot access in several areas, but because they didn't run candidates. And so now they're trying to rebuild. Libertarians managed to maintain ballot access in Missouri for a long time. And as I decided to help the Libertarian Party because I wanted to help make things fair, I began to slowly realize this is where I belonged the whole time. And yeah, there's the whole guilt tripping of who's paying for your schooling. You're going here on grants and this and that. In the end, I'm paying for it because I have student loans I have to pay back. And being young and inexperienced, I took out loans, yes. Some of them, to live off of. And unfortunately, I made some bad choices. And now that I've learned from them, I need to fix that so that it doesn't happen again in the future. And part of that is owning that responsibility, paying those loans back. So ultimately, I'm footing the bill. It's just I decided to be billed later for it, and I'm paying for it now. Then again, I changed my major twice. I still do computers, but I do it on my own terms, not the college's. I was going to be a journalism major before they consolidated and changed that to digital media. And when I was told that it's not the job of a reporter to elevate higher levels of thinking, that's when I realized, no, that's not something I wanted to do. Because to me, when newspapers were spicier in the day, so to speak, in the eras of muckrakers, an 8th grade education went a lot farther than it does today. You look at old 8th grade tests for history and what have you from the early 1900s, 1800s, it's more difficult than it is today. There was a different mentality. And part of it is because busybodies meddle in the affairs of teachers, and they don't let teachers do their high calling, which is mentor, teach. And when that happens, you only have people who are able to regurgitate, not think, build new ideas. But that's a concept for another episode. I didn't become libertarian overnight. It was a slow evolution, and I'm still evolving in that area. And the idea behind libertarianism is that there is a broad brushstroke, but it's mainly meant for those who are in political office. In political office, it is indeed fiscal conservatism and social acceptance, social tolerance, or a social liberal. So don't do wasteful spending, but let people marry whomever they wish to marry. Let's not, regardless of sexual orientation, identity, whatever you want to call it. And, there are those who go further and say get government out of the marriage business. And I lean towards that, but I accept reality and say let's transition to that point. We're not going to get there overnight because there are millions of family laws regarding family and things like that. And there's also the so-called tax benefits, et cetera, so on and so forth, that have to be addressed over a long period of time. Otherwise, we're screwed. So, my understanding is changing over the years. You notice that in terms of abortion, libertarians don't always agree with one another, except for the idea that organizations like Planned Parenthood should not be even indirectly subsidized by the federal government. But we hold that to be true for a lot of federal programs, that it shouldn't be subsidized by the federal government, even indirectly. So other than that concept is left up to the individual to decide for themselves, because it is a touchy subject and it creates a lot of controversy. And I have my own views entirely that doesn't involve sitting on that fence. So there's that. There's also the concept of live and let live. Outside of government, that's a good portion of the idea behind it. If you do what you want to do, so long as you do not hurt other people. Do not attack somebody unprovoked, and don't defraud them, and don't bully them into doing things they otherwise wouldn't be doing. It's really a lot of it's really simple concepts, some of which can be hard to implement because you're dealing with individuals. So some people would throw me in the minarchist camp, which is fine. But then again, I'm a realist in that regards, because anarchy didn't build the roads. Now, people did build the roads, and people maintain them to this day. But at some point, we need to recognize that people do things. Bureaucracies may every now and then throw out edicts that actually work, but it's the people that implement them. And there are some things that government is not equipped to handle. Abortion is one of them. It's not equipped to handle this. Former Congressman Ron Paul alluded to this, that they cannot say, government should not be saying it should be against the law. They shouldn't be saying it's legal either. They shouldn't be touching this one way or another. And that's a more appropriate response. There are times where solutions don't always entail the ballot box or talking to your favorite bureaucrat. Sometimes the people have to roll up their sleeves and figure out a solution and implement it themselves. So going back to abortion, which again, it's going to more in depth later on is what, but I can do something in a nutshell for that, for the purpose of explaining things today. With abortion, both sides come up with excellent arguments, excellent points, both sides of that fence. The problem is that they're hanging around the wrong fence. Abortion's a symptom of a deeper issue at play that government cannot resolve. It's not equipped, nor will it ever be equipped to handle that. The people have to handle it. Change the culture. So we don't ask, how does a woman wind up making a decision like that one way or another in the first place? Well, if it's because they were sexually assaulted, we need to figure out how we can help mitigate that. Because realistically, we're not going to stop all of those instances, but we sure as hell can go a long way in trying to get that reduced. Because laws alone are insufficient for it. Teach self-defense courses, tell everyone that there's certain touching that's okay and there's certain touching that's not okay. There's consent and knowing the difference between being able to consent and not being able to consent. those sorts of things. And that's what we're talking about. Yes, it entails taking on an immense amount of responsibility. But with that responsibility comes empowerment to freedom. It may seem like a big burden now, but the moment we find ways to solve problems without legislation, it'll be the moment that we are actually evolving into something better than yesterday. Right now, we're still kind of, feeling the after effects of the Orlando shooting. Somebody recently came forward and claimed that they were a lover of the shooter, friends with benefits, so to speak, and that he went to that nightclub and shot it up not because he was loyal to ISIS, not because he was screaming about some foreign policy, which we do need to explore that too, but because he was given an STD by somebody, and that's where he was hurt the most. And he wanted to make some people pay. He wanted revenge. It was an act of vengeance, not anything else. So, what we have is somebody literally playing a game of telephone with the 911 operator and with other people, obfuscating, distorting, and everything else in between. When applying Occam's razor shows that sometimes the most primal things are the reasons why things happen. But in response to that, shooting ranges have opened up their doors to those in the LGBT community. And people, regardless of sexual orientation, identity, what have you, they've been training themselves, getting trained on firearm safety, how to operate a firearm safely, and what have you, in record numbers. And what do certain politicians do in response to the fact that a non-due process list didn't pass Congress? They basically throw a temper tantrum. And I have a problem with that. Now, of course, you have Ted Cruz saying this is all political theater, which he would know because he did it too, reading Green Eggs and Ham over C-SPAN. So both parties are hypocrites. You have Democrats who argued against the no-fly list, and now they're advocating using a similar list to prevent people from obtaining firearms, even though they have never been convicted of a crime. That's hypocrisy at its finest. And that's a double standard, and it isn't right. And both parties are guilty of this. Certain Republicans were all for that no-fly list until it affected their Second Amendment rights of their constituents. Democrats were against the no-fly list so long as, it didn't involve the Second Amendment at all. Either way, it's two entities wanting to tell you how to live your life, and that's not okay. And people on both sides of that argument have been acting, frankly, like children. And it worries me. I've encountered a few who are willing to have a mature discussion. And don't get me wrong, I understand people dying, making people angry, and saying we've got to do something. how about you do something instead of pushing politicians to write some piece of legislation that can get screwed up by several other legislators in Congress? Because that's what's going to happen. Even things that turn out to be a good idea, a poison pill can be inserted into a bill for the sole purpose of killing it. So that's, where I stand on that. If we are to talk about the rights of the people, the Constitution, we need to be consistent across the board on it. Yeah, the founders, and before anybody makes the argument of the founders being for slavery, they even admitted in the beginning portions of the Constitution that they were putting it off for so many years. They admitted that it was a peculiar institution, and that, but they're not ready to basically deal with it at this time, and that 20 years or so they would then deal with it. They put it off for so long. They should have started addressing it then and there, but they were human too, and were bound to make mistakes. So I nearly turned, into some progressive mouthpiece, only to recognize that it wasn't true progress being made. I'm one of those that says, let's optimize this thing and get it to the point where we're not wasting money, but getting, good results. Let the people live their lives as long as they're not hurting everybody else. Let's end the drug war. And yes, free trade, but truly free trade, not something that's going to violate the sovereignty of other countries either. And that's pretty much where I stand. What you're going to discover about libertarians is that a lot of them will debate on a lot of different things. And a lot of them are academically inclined, even without college degrees. They're big on debate. But we're more than just a debate society. Yeah, we have an academic wing of it. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's sometimes what's kept us in check from going off the rails and going, whoa, this isn't letting people live their lives as long as they're not hurting anybody else. Let's back away from this. And by far, Gary Johnson, William Weld, they're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but they come off as more human. And even on the town hall, they were seen as kind of, they have their own views on things, and they may not necessarily agree on everything. But that's what makes this whole thing beautiful, because the individual is valued too. And different ideas are allowed. They're not blind clones of one another. They're human. And that's going to help a lot of people make a decision come this November. So, some more things about me. I own multiple computers. I'm one of those that, likes their smartphone, likes their, likes their tablet. I'm never buying RCA tablets again. I've not had very good luck with them. This one just up and reboots mysteriously for no apparent reason, and I am not in the mood to go through their warranty process. So yeah, I have a life outside of the political arena. And again, I'm one of those candidates that will make a Dragon Ball Z reference because Well, it's more like over 10,000, but I can say I got over 9,000 votes in 2012. And it was a pretty good year for the Libertarian Party as well. So over the course of the next several episodes, I'm going to be slowly introducing everybody to the concept of libertarianism. What does it mean? What does it entail? And there's going to be a lot of minor things that are debated because, as a friend of mine put it, trying to get a bunch of libertarians to do something is like herding a bunch of cats. And I can understand that analogy. And in some cases, it's a good thing. Some cases, it can be a hindrance. It's finding the common ground to work together on some things, and then, all right, let's go our own way. But the fact of the matter is, we allow room for some disagreement. The Libertarian parties existed since the 1970s, and unlike the so-called GOP, it can actually be referred to as the true Big Tent Party because it's open to a lot of demographics. Marriage equality, they've advocated that since its inception. End the drug war, lower taxation. Those are things that have been advocated for a long time. Freedom of association. Those sorts of things. And no, we're not going to agree on everything. And that's understandable. And the idea is to evolve to the point where we don't need certain pieces of legislation that pushes us to treat each other a little bit better than in the past. But we need to get there first. And that's why I said before, if you want government out of your life, you're going to have to take initiative and a lot of responsibility on your shoulders. But that will ultimately free you up and liberate you. But you have to be responsible. And it's hard to implement because a lot of people wish, true progress was easier. And that, and a lot of us get impatient. We want a better environment now. We want wonderful, things to happen now. We want violence to stop now. But we go about it the wrong way. And we don't recognize that these things don't happen in a single night. It's going to take time, a lot of it, in order to get to that point. So instead of advocating laws, let's say you have a child of your own, you introduce them to the concept of the non-aggression principle, where much like the concept that don't fire unless fired upon, don't attack somebody unprovoked, don't coerce them into doing something they otherwise wouldn't be doing, and don't screw them over. The golden rule: if you want to be treated well, treat others well. And if that person doesn't treat you well, don't associate with them. Walk away from them. So that's the sort of concepts that I'm introducing to everybody in this podcast. And it's not going to always be all politics all the time, but this one will focus more on politics. The other podcasts that I will be picking up again, hopefully with all my co-hosts, we're still trying to work that out. I had some co-hosts in the past where all we would talk about was politics. And that wasn't what that show was about. It would cover some politics, but it wasn't meant to cover it all the time. So this show, more political stuff will be covered on this show because that's, a more appropriate, show for that. The other podcast that I do is The Next Report, which will be available in the, notes for this video once it's, archived on YouTube, and in the show notes on the podcast page, which will also be published later on. So I wanted to just introduce myself. Hopefully I did that adequately. And I'll basically be telling you a little bit more about myself as time goes on. But for now, I'm just going to, leave you with this. If you want to make things a little bit better, ask yourself, can this one thing entail government as a last resort, not the first? If the answer is yes, you're one step closer to liberty. So with that in mind, live free, so long as you do no harm unto others, and you have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for listening.